So in the news for the past several weeks, I made mention of it when we were talking about the offering, giving to the fires in LA. We've been hearing lots and lots of news about all of the devastation that has been going on there. Stories of homes being lost, of fires just destroying all of these neighborhoods and residences as it kind of rips through those places. And when that happens, as it happens really in any disaster, people are devastated by these types of losses, especially when it is their own homes that have been impacted. But it isn't just the financial loss that leads to this kind of distress. But it's also because there's a loss of keepsakes, of treasured items that people have held dear. It's a loss of a home where memories have been made over the course, sometimes of many, many years. It could be the laughter of a newly married couple, the struggles, but even through that, the successes to stretch payments to be able to pay a mortgage. It's the first steps of a child. It could be family meals. It could even be the trials, again, but the successes of caring for and keeping up a home. Tracy, I'm getting a little bit of feedback up here. If we could just make sure all the other microphones are muted. But with the lick of some flames, as it was happening in LA, all of it was brought down to ashes. And somebody who's staring into what used to be their home and is looking at that, they might ask themselves if all of this investment of time, all of this investment of money, in everything that they had, everything that they kept, was that worth it? Was it really worth it investing in those ways? Did it amount to anything if now all it is a bunch of ashes? The answer to that, of course, is it depends. It depends. Mostly, probably, on what our return was on those investments into that home. The things that we would likely say were a good return on those investments, the things that maybe we would consider it most worth what we put in, would probably be those things that maybe enabled relationships to flourish, or those things that were able to create spaces for those lasting memories. So how we invest, how we would invest in a home, is going to directly influence ultimately what comes out of it, even how we would enjoy and think back and be satisfied with the life that we experienced because of that investment. This is true of our dwelling places, but it's also true of other things in life, even in a more general sense. In our passage today, as we're going to be looking at this, it's going to show us that the road to greater satisfaction, to greater enjoyment in our lives as a whole, depends on how we invest. So if we want true satisfaction in life, if we really want to enjoy life and have that deeper enjoyment of our lives, then Solomon is going to have some wisdom for each and every one of us this morning. So as was mentioned, we're continuing in Ecclesiastes. We're going to be looking at chapter 1 and 2 today. There was a misprint on the slide. I apologize for that. We're starting in verse 13 in chapter 1. So if you please open your Bibles to Ecclesiastes 1 and 2, that's where we're going to be looking at today, and you can follow along with the text. If you're not that familiar with the book, and I mentioned this last week, if you're like me, which a lot of times I find the book by just flipping through the Bible until it opens to that page. Ecclesiastes is hard to find because it is so short, but if you find either Isaiah or Proverbs, it's located between those two books. So it's right after Proverbs, and along with Song of Songs, it's before the book of Isaiah. Both of those are pretty big books. So Ecclesiastes is located in the Old Testament. And so this is some wisdom that King Solomon, who was the ancient king of Israel, is sharing. He shared for his original hearers, but also, of course, because this is God's inspired word, it is applicable for us today as well. But I do want to do a very brief recap this morning of what we talked about last week, because last week sort of laid the foundations for being able to understand and properly interpret this book. So we're just going to go through a couple things that we focused on last week. The first was that in many cases, Solomon uses words differently with slightly different or nuanced definitions from what we might typically use those words in our everyday speech. And also, Solomon sometimes uses the same word in a couple different ways throughout the book. So we need to be careful when we're coming to the book of Ecclesiastes to not just sort of bring in our own preconceived ideas and just assume that that is what Solomon is saying to us. Because if we do that, we're going to misunderstand what he's talking about. And probably one of the biggest words, the one that stands out of the three that we talked about last week, is this word vanity or meaningless, which, depending on your translation, it's probably one of those two words that is in there. But when Solomon talks about vanity, when he talks about something being meaningless, he's not talking about pride, and he's not suggesting that something has no meaning. That's not how he's using those words. Rather, when he uses these words, he's trying to convey a sense of fleetinglessness in life, like a vapor, a breath. So when we read something like vanity of vanities or meaningless, basically Solomon is saying everything in this world is fleeting. It's here today, it's gone tomorrow. It's not worth investing in those things because they are so temporary. Another word that we talked about was this word toil. And when we talk about toil, when we think of toil, we think of that as being sort of a negative kind of word. It has sort of a negative connotation. But again, Solomon uses this word a little bit differently. He is speaking of work, but not inherently unpleasant or pleasant work. It's more of a neutral term. So again, just keep that in mind when you read the word toil. And then the last word that we need to touch on again briefly is this word wisdom. Sometimes when Solomon is talking about wisdom, he's talking about wisdom of great value. Things like wisdom about God and the things of God. But at other times, he's speaking of wisdom that is lesser value, that's more temporary, that is more fleeting, wisdom of the things of this world. And again, we need to make sure we're looking at the broader context to understand what kind of wisdom that Solomon is talking about. Otherwise, it can be a little bit confusing. And if you want a more full explanation of how we got to these definitions, I would encourage you to look at the sermon and listen to that from last week. Last week, we also talked about how in Ecclesiastes, Solomon doesn't just provide his conclusions. He's not just providing a bunch of final points of theology, but he's also giving us his experiences, his emotions, and his thought process along the way. So kind of how he arrived at the final conclusion in addition to that conclusion. Now, my wife and I, and this is probably true in most families, my wife and I have very different ways of processing information. She's an external processor. I am an internal processor. She likes to know how somebody gets from point A to point B. I pretty much only care about point B, right? Just the end kind of thing. So sometimes we'll be in conversation and I'll be relaying to her, about an interaction maybe that I had with somebody. And I might kind of talk a little bit about how that ended, but she'll want the play-by-play. I said this, then she said that, then I said this, and it's a back and forth, and there's a good chance that I won't remember any of that because in my brain I've just sort of dumped all that information and just held on to the final points in the end. At other times, maybe when we're talking, maybe I'll say something nice to her or do something nice for her, and she'll want to know the whole progression of thought of why I did that thing. So not just that I did it, but, what made you think of that? How do we get all the way to you finally doing whatever that is? And again, there's a good chance I don't even remember because I've sort of dumped all of that information. But I've learned from these sorts of encounters is that she actually connects with me more by understanding the journey of my thought process, not just the final answer at the end. And I think if we think about it, there is a lot to be gained from understanding the journey that anybody goes down with whatever it is that they happen to think. For example, somebody who is very self-controlled, well, that's all the more impressive if we learn and it's even more informative to us if we learn that in their past they were very impulsive in some way. A person's loss is a lot more relatable if we learn how much they loved in the past. And we can trust a person's conclusions better about whatever the thing is when we learn that they went through a very detailed process, whether by experience or by just mental analysis, so we can trust their conclusions that they really looked at everything because we're understanding that they understood the whole picture. So within Ecclesiastes, when we're looking at the book of Ecclesiastes, all of these sorts of things are coming together. Because again, Solomon is sharing with us his physical, his intellectual, and his emotional journey in addition to those final conclusions. But there's a little bit of a risk, and I think this is why there's some confusion with this book, because if we don't remember that some of the portions of the book are his journey, we might confuse them with the conclusions themselves. Because again, it's a journey. It might not be exactly the same. So we can't confuse the final destination and conclusion with what is just sort of a journey in the process. So we need to keep this in mind, not only for our passage this morning, but really for the book at large. Now, if you've read Ecclesiastes 1:13 through all of chapter 2, if you've kind of looked at this section, it is possible that reading it, you found it maybe a little bit disjointed, a little bit confusing, perhaps repetitive, or even contradictory in some way. Just kind of looking at this little section. And I don't actually think this is Solomon's fault. I mean, it's not that he was not being clear or trying to be clear with his argument. I actually think this has more to do with how our Bibles have been published. So basically how the publishers and the translations have kind of grouped together different things in our Bibles. Because normally, in our Bibles, we have, all these little section breaks. I mean, mine's got, little bold sections, some titles, paragraph divisions, stuff like that. I mean, that's normal in our Bibles. And usually those things are very helpful. They help us to find things easier. They help us to have a better understanding of, okay, well, this is a cohesive thought here, and it's separate from this one over here. Again, normally I like that stuff. It's normally very good. But those things aren't divinely inspired. Again, those are just from our publishers. And I think in this passage, at least what I have found here, is that the publishers have actually kind of muddied the water with how they are trying to divide up this section. I mean, not that it's the most straightforward thing in the world, but I think that the titles actually make it a little bit more confusion, even how they break some things up at times. So as we're getting into this morning, I think what will be helpful for us, and even going forward as you're discussing this in your discipleship groups, is to maybe look at this, and again, my take on this is not divinely inspired either, but maybe think about grouping this in a slightly different way, because at least for me, I found this to be a little bit more helpful. And so basically, there's 4 broad sections that I see in here. Solomon's pursuit of book smarts, then Solomon's pursuit of street smarts, then Solomon's sort of comparative evaluation of book and street smarts, and then his final conclusions at the very end. And we're going to touch on these different sections briefly, but again, this is, I think, helpful to kind of see things under sort of more broad and combined categories of similar types of discussions. So this first section is on book smarts. It's talking about book smarts. So this is basically Solomon's pursuit of head knowledge, not personal experience, just head knowledge. So about everything, whether it's good, whether it's bad, wise or unwise, his understanding of all these things. Beginning of verse 13, it says, "And I applied my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven." So again, he's seeking to know everything. He's searching out everything under heaven. But then Solomon adds to that in verse 14, and he basically says, well, I've accumulated all this knowledge, but ultimately, book smarts, all this information is vanity. It's ultimately fleeting in the end. That is kind of his conclusion. So then he moves into a second section, which really comprises of the majority of this whole passage we're looking at this morning, where he starts to talk about street smarts. And I'm just calling it street smarts, but basically this is application. This is personal experience, experiential knowledge as opposed to just head knowledge. It begins in verse 16, where he says, "And I said in my heart, I have acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who are over Jerusalem before me. And my heart has had great experience of wisdom and knowledge. And I applied my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly." So at the beginning of 16, Solomon says, look, I've acquired all this wisdom. And he's had experience with it in that sense, that he's got this head knowledge, so he's thought about these things. But then it says, just a little bit later here, that he applied his heart to know wisdom. To know wisdom. Know wisdom, madness, and folly. And that word know, if you kind of look up what that means in the original language, that has more of a personal interaction with it. It's a personal connection, more so than the word experience from verse 16. So this, again, is him personally seeking to experience, to live out this knowledge that he has already acquired in his head. When it came to the wise knowledge and his sort of application of that, he speaks of that in verse 18. He says, "For much wisdom is much vexation, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow." Now Solomon, who he was, and it seems like how he was up to that point in his life, he had been living a wise life. So he could just sort of conclude this right off the bat. But he hadn't necessarily been, in application and personal experience, living an unwise life. This life of madness and folly. And he actually goes into much more detail in this in the next part, looking into chapter 2. He says this, starting in verse 1 of chapter 2. "I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure. Enjoy yourself. But behold, this also was vanity. I said of laughter, it is mad, and of pleasure, what use is it? I searched with my heart how to cheer my body with wine, my heart still guiding me with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was good for the children of man to do under heaven during the few days of his life." And I just want you to take note of the words that I've highlighted here. I mean, wisdom in here as well. He's using his wisdom of the unwise stuff. He's thinking about things analytically in a broader sense. But in application, he's talking about living a life of pleasure, of madness, of folly. And again, all those words are showing up. He said he was going to do it. This is him actually proceeding to go do it. And really everything that follows all the way until verse 11 is Solomon's attempt to live by pleasure, madness, and folly. So all of it in one big group. And then verses 4 through 10, if you look at those, they start to detail specifically what that life of madness, folly, and pleasure look like. He built great works. He built houses. He built gardens and pools. He had slaves. He had all these possessions of herds. He had gold, great wealth, singers, concubines, and greatness above everyone around him. Verse 10 says he took whatever he desired. He denied himself no pleasure. And he considered all this a reward for his work. So yes, there is definitely a pleasure component of this, and I think a lot of times our translations will, the way that the editors have put it, they'll emphasize the pleasure part, but really, again, looking back at verses 1 through 3, this is about all those things together. This is a foolish way of living. This is madness, this sort of pleasure-centered life. And if you look in verses 4 through 10, you can see how many I statements are in there. He says it all the time. I did this for myself. I did that for myself. Me, 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 me. That is very much the focus of that entire section. A life that is lived focused on self is a life of madness and folly. That's what that life looks like. And his conclusion at the end of that little section in 2:11 was this too is vanity. This is meaningless in the end to live this way. You may be familiar with the name Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie was born in Scotland. He immigrated to the United States at the age of 12. And as he became an adult, he became a leader in the American steel industry. Eventually, he became one of the richest Americans in our history. But had it been the entirety of his story was sort of a rags to riches kind of situation, I mean, that would have been notable, but we probably wouldn't be familiar with his name today if that was all that his life was about. He probably would have already been forgotten. But Andrew Carnegie had some very strong beliefs about how a life should be lived, especially his own life. He felt that they should conform to this following order: to spend the first third of one's life getting all the education one can, the second third making all the money that one can, and then in the last third giving all of it away for worthwhile causes. Now, the first 2 points of his dictum here, of his life, those are very much self-focused. But the last portion isn't really self-focused at all. Knowing a little bit about Andrew Carnegie and later on in his years, over that last part of his life, he established over 3,000 public libraries in the United States and abroad. He established institutions dedicated to education, science, and music, and some of those names you're probably familiar with. Things like Carnegie Mellon University, Carnegie Institution for Science, and Carnegie Hall. And actually, in the last 18 years of his life, he gave away almost 90% of his fortune, which would be the equivalent, and this is pretty staggering, today, in today's dollars, the amount he gave away in those 18 years was about $10.5 billion that he gave. This is a big part of why Carnegie is remembered. Now, in some ways, we have to be self-focused. And again, the first part of Andrew Carnegie's life was self-focused. There are things that we need to do to be able to grow and to be able to prepare for the next stage ahead. But it's the other focused aspects of our lives, and really it's the other focused aspect of Carnegie's life that made all the difference. Because that's where the true enjoyment and satisfaction from our lives comes from. Solomon, in this passage, concluded that living wisely, just for the sake of living wisely for oneself, was ultimately meaningless. And he also concluded that living foolishly was meaningless. He concluded that the legacy of both those who are wise and who are foolish, they might be remembered for a little bit, but eventually they're going to be forgotten. And he concluded that accumulation, regardless of what that was, ultimately, if that is sort of the end-all, be-all purpose, that too is meaningless. This was sort of the summation of what he concluded from all of this practical living out of the knowledge that he had gained. So he was dejected. He was depressed. What is the point? Why bother putting in all of this extra work? Why bother with anything? Because everything is meaningless. It's vanity. It is fleeting. That has no lasting value. But fortunately, he doesn't end there. That's not the conclusion that he reached. So after Solomon leads through this whole investigative process, and he sort of points out his thoughts and observations and, short conclusions along the way, he arrives at his conclusion in this very last section. And if you remember from last week, I talked about what I saw as sort of the main point of Ecclesiastes. And I talked about how, from what I saw, that the main point is to seize and enjoy the moment with this important, critical caveat of doing that within the limits of honoring and obeying God. And even in this passage, in this conclusion we're about to look at, hopefully you will see how this is really kind of coming to light. Now, different parts of the book, they may emphasize the second part, the caveat, a little bit more. Other sections of the book emphasize sort of the seizing and enjoying the moment more, but both things are there. Both things are critical and important to our understanding of what the overarching theme is, and again, so that we can gain a proper understanding of the individual passage that we're looking at. So I just want to look at here these last three verses, Ecclesiastes 2:24 through 26. He says, "There is nothing better for a person than he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil." Again, this is his concluding thoughts. This also I saw is from the hand of God. For apart from him, who can eat or who can have enjoyment? For to the one who pleases him, God has given wisdom and knowledge and joy. But to the sinner, he has given the business of gathering and collecting, only to give to one who pleases God. This also is vanity and a striving after the wind. So more me, whether it is done in a wise way or a foolish way, ultimately amounts to nothing in the end. We're all going to be eventually forgotten. Any of our contributions to this world are ultimately going to go to somebody else. If our investment that we put into this life that we are living is mostly about us, we are going to be disappointed in the end. But Solomon says, it is only the one who pleases God who can really seize and enjoy their life, who can seize and enjoy the moment. And how do we please God? Well, we have the summary of the first greatest commandment, to love God with all our heart, soul, and mind. The second greatest commandment is to love people. So we please God by living out these two commandments. So maybe even in a somewhat ironic way, the path to enjoying life is not being self-focused, but it's being God-focused. And it's by being other people focused, not self-focused. Imagine it wasn't your house that burned down in something like the LA fires. What if it was your church? What if it was this church that was engulfed in flames? Was the time that you came here on Sunday mornings worth it? Were the ways you served in this community worth it? Was the money you gave worth it if the church is reduced to ashes? What was the return on your investment in those types of things? Now, if you were doing things, whatever it was you were doing in the church, here or elsewhere, mainly just to feel good or to not feel guilty about not doing something, or maybe to earn a point with God in some way, or to see your church friends, if these were the types of reasons really that are mostly about you and me, then there's a good chance that we won't feel like our investment was all that worth it, because the material structure ultimately burned down. Unfortunately, many Christians, and I think we all can kind of get caught up in this, we have adopted a very me-centered approach to our faith and even to our churches, a very me way of thinking about them. And if it's not just us as individuals, often it doesn't go beyond our immediate family. Because church, in many ways, the way we think about it, again, maybe not even realizing it, but church has become a product we consume. So if the product is good, we consume more, and if it's not so good, well, then we look somewhere else. But a faith that is lived out this way, that is mostly about ourselves and our self-gratification, is ultimately going to feel hollow and perhaps even worthless, meaningless. In a marriage where only one partner or one partner is only in that marriage for themselves, that marriage is likely to fail because it's all about them. If my faith is mostly about you, mostly about me, what happens when our faith stops benefiting us as much as it did? What happens to our faith then? If you've made it through the crisis and now you're kind of good, where's your faith? If you needed friends, but now you have friends, you don't really need the church friends as much, what does your faith look like? If you needed prayer and counsel, but now life's pretty good, what happens to your faith? How will your faith fare when maybe some of those things aren't benefiting you in the way they have in the past? If the reason we go to church is primarily to meet our own needs, theologically we are missing the main reason to go to church. And if the only reason, or maybe even the primary reason we are Christian, is just so we don't go to hell, then we're actually missing a critically important and enjoyable aspect to why we follow Jesus in the first place. And perhaps a little bit disconcertingly, there's an unpleasantly close resemblance to a faith walk and a church way of functioning that is very individual-focused, me-focused, that resembles in many ways this life of madness and folly that Solomon experienced and ultimately concluded was meaningless. So as your pastor, I'm committed to more for you. I'm committed to more for me and for us than this me-centered, self-focused mindset of Christianity. Not only for us as individuals and our own individual maturity, but even as a congregation and what we are doing as a whole. For this reason, what we do here, whether we are gathering on a Sunday or we are doing anything throughout the course of the week, those things must be primarily God-focused and secondarily other people-focused. Even other people beyond just those others who might be in our congregation. Now, maybe, I talked about cleaning in the beginning and the announcements. Maybe you've been part of the cleaning crew. Maybe you've cleaned this church or a church. Maybe you did that so that you wouldn't feel guilty or somebody would nag you about doing it. Maybe you cleaned the church because, okay, you wanted the congregation to, when they gathered on a Sunday, to sort of have a nice space for them to do that. But if these were kind of your mindsets in cleaning, why you were cleaning, there's a good chance that you became dissatisfied with doing that. And if not already, then probably at some point you will. Because there's plenty of other ways to feel less guilty than cleaning the church, which most people don't like to do. There's plenty of other people who can clean who are here, right? So it's very easy to just become dissatisfied with this thing that you might be doing, this way that you might be serving. But if you've ever cleaned the church or a church, so that someone maybe who has never been to church can more easily connect with God, or if you've cleaned the church so that overwhelmed mom who is just exhausted from her week, she can have a place that she knows is safe for her children, or if you've ever cleaned as a means of praising God and glorifying Him through the work that you are investing, that is a totally different cleaning experience. And wholly more satisfying and enjoyable with that kind of investment. Because it's no longer just about us and not feeling guilty or feeling good about what we did. Now it's about glorifying God and serving everybody else. But it's more than just a mental mind shift as well. I mean, that is a mental shift of how we're thinking, but there's more to it than that as well. This is why we as a church have and continue to function in such a way where we have ministries that their whole purpose is to function out there, beyond these church walls. Moms Group. We have Moms Group here. Moms Group was not developed to serve moms in this church. Now, it may serve the moms in this church, but that is not why it was developed. It was developed from the outset to meet the moms who don't know God, to interact with them and to bring them not only the gospel, but also to introduce them into a fellowship of other Christian believers. Kids Club, from its inception, was not designed to serve kids in this church. That's not what its purpose was. From the very beginning, it was designed and continues to be specifically a way of engaging Saratoga Village Mobile Home Park in this case, to reach those kids who may have no other Jesus in their lives, nobody else who may even be in relationship with God. That is the purpose of that ministry. And these aren't the only ministries like that. There are other ministries that we have been involved with and continue to invest in to try and be very outreach and mission-oriented in that way. But I can't do that alone. In some of those ministries, I'm not involved at all. And no individual here can do any of that work by themselves. It really takes all of us, all of the congregation. It takes you, it takes me. It means all of us need to be sharing, inviting others in. It means all of our ministries need to in some way be proclaiming Jesus. And it means that we must be making sure that our ministries are meeting the needs of our community. Because our mindset can't be that we're just going to build a place where we can be isolated and protected from the world. That the mindset needs to be that we're going to be a place to invite the world to come meet Jesus. That needs to be the mindset that we maintain. And everybody, this is, I think, good news. Everyone can participate in some way. God's invited everybody into these things. If not directly, although we're all called to share the gospel, but even if we can't always do these things in a direct way. I'm not a mom, so I can't be in mom's group. But I can support mom's group, right? So even if we can't directly serve, we can always support so that others in our community can be continuing to reach out to our community with the gospel. I have some sheets. Ron's got them, and the ushers are going to pass these out as I'm continuing to share this last part of the sermon. If you were at the annual meeting, you probably got one of these, but you can take one again. That's totally fine. Ministry isn't just for the healthy. Sometimes we can think, okay, well, ministry is just for people who kind of have it all together in some way or another. Ministry is not just for the young. It's not just for the old. It's not just for those who have kids. It's not just for those who don't have kids. It's not just for those who are smart. It's not just for those who are physically fit. All of us can participate. No matter who you are, where you are in your journey with Jesus, if you know him, he has called you into ministry. So we can all participate. Now, I'm saying this partially because there are real needs here. There are needs in this church that need to be met and filled in some way. But I'm also saying this in relation to what Solomon has said, is that God says the path to enjoyment and satisfaction is beyond yourself, is beyond myself. This is the enjoyment and satisfaction that we seek. So use the gifts that God has given you. Use those gifts. The church needs them, of course, but other people need them. And God is glorified when you use that which he has equipped you with. Because God says this in Ecclesiastes, to the one who pleases him, God has given wisdom and knowledge and joy. So giving out this piece of paper is us being practical with this information, taking it beyond just kind of hearing about it and applying it. So I want us to be seeking to put this into action, not only today, but really in this entire year, to be practical. So on that list, there's all sorts of different ministries, and it's not an exhaustive list, as it says on top, all sorts of different ministries and needs in the church. Some of those things require leadership. Many of them do not. Some of them are outreach-focused. Some of them are people-focused. Other ones are not. Other ones are much more supportive in their role. Some require you to be healthy, others don't. They don't even require you to leave your house. Some require more commitment, others are just a once a year kind of commitment. But there's something on this list that every single person here, in some way, is capable of doing. Now, it's possible you might look at the list and be like, oh, well, this thing's being done, and this thing's being done, and this thing's being done. And maybe it's being done well. That may very well be true. But it's also quite likely that the person who's doing that thing is not doing something else. That maybe they feel like God is nudging them to do, but this other thing needs to be done, so they can't do that. And even as we're thinking here, part of the vision for 2025 is we are looking at expanding our mission impact in our community. We want to do more outreach, but we have to further equip and even retool some of our ministries to be able to better do that. But we can't do that extra outreach without the extra support coming back behind it for those other things that need to be done. So the prayerful ask is, if you've been at this church for 6 months or more, if you consider this church your home, I'm asking you to prayerfully consider another means of participating and serving here, beyond what you may be doing right now. Not only for perhaps your own spiritual growth and health. I don't know exactly where you might be necessarily in that process, but I can definitely say when we're thinking about the health of the church, the overall mission, I want us to be as much as possible other person focused and of God focused. And it is just that tendency in churches to just become more and more self-focused, and we really need to be deliberate to not go that way. So to look at 2025 and to look at expanding our vision outwards to sharing the gospel with our community, the ask is that we all kind of support to that end or actively participate in that way. The path to enjoying life is not being self-focused, but being God-focused and being other person-focused. So let's prayerfully take active steps towards this today. Please join me in prayer. Lord, we thank you that you've invited us into your mission to spread the good news, to share the gospel, nearby and far away. You've invited us to participate in ministry as you've called each and every person here to follow you and to serve with you. But God, we know it can be our tendency to sometimes just sort of sit back and let things go by. Sometimes it's just sort of assume that everything is being taken care of and everything looks good without us, so we don't really need to do anything. But that's not your call for us, Lord. There are souls in our community that don't know you, don't know of you, and don't know anybody who does. And you're asking us to reach out to them. So God, we just pray that our church community, together as we are one body, each person here with individual parts, that we would be unified, fully supportive, fully embracing your mission to love you, to love people, and make disciples. Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.